Bruce Lee faced a legendary kickboxer. 8 seconds later, the fight became history in the making. They say the exchange lasted less than 8 seconds. By the time the crowd understood what had happened, the challenge had already dissolved. The larger man, celebrated, decorated, undefeated in his own discipline, was no longer advancing. He was standing still, eyes altered, certainty interrupted. Bruce Lee had not raised his voice. He had not circled. He had not even appeared to prepare. And yet, from that moment forward, the story was no longer about a fight. It was about a method no one in the room fully understood, until it was too late. The hall was quiet in a way that felt deliberate, as if the air itself had been trained to hold attention. Polished wooden floors reflected the soft light from the high windows, catching the edges of the mirrors that lined one wall. On the other side, rows of students sat in neat lines, uniforms pressed and belts tied with care. Their eyes were fixed forward, but not on any single person. Rather, on the weight of expectation that filled the room. At the center of it all stood the visitor, a kickboxer whose reputation preceded him. He was known for his public demonstrations, for a kind of certainty in movement that carried both intimidation and respect. His name had been spoken in gyms across the region, each syllable carrying the authority of past victories. But here, in this room, there was another presence that had quietly begun to shift that authority. Bruce Lee did not stand at the center. He lingered near the edge, hands relaxed at his sides, eyes observing. There was no flourish in his posture, no outward claim of dominance. Yet, those who knew him or thought they did felt the difference immediately. The space around him seemed to pulse subtly, not with tension, but with control. Every student felt it, even if they could not articulate why. The hall itself had a rhythm. The gentle creak of floorboards underfoot, the distant hum of city streets beyond the walls, the soft rustle of cloth as students shifted their weight. Into that rhythm entered the kickboxer, his presence solid, his movements measured. He acknowledged the room with a brief nod, a ritual gesture that spoke more of custom than of respect. And yet, even his authority seemed momentarily fragile in the presence of Bruce's stillness. Conversations ceased before they began. Whispers stopped mid-air. The hall was not anticipating a confrontation, at least not yet. It was anticipating observation. Witnesses would later describe this moment not as a prelude to combat, but as a test of presence, a subtle negotiation of awareness and control. Bruce's gaze was calm, scanning the room, noting posture, alignment, stance. He was not sizing up the kickboxer with aggression, but with precision. Every foot, every angle, every micro-adjustment of the challenger's form was registered. And in that observation lay authority. Not shouted, not flaunted, but undeniable. The kickboxer, accustomed to crowds, to displays, to measurable dominance, seemed to sense the shift even before any formal challenge was issued. His movements, once confident, acquired a quiet hesitation. The students noticed this, though they could not name it. The hierarchy in the room, the clear distinction between challenger and observer, was already bending, not through confrontation, but through presence. In those few silent minutes, the hall held a single, unspoken agreement. Reputation alone could not dictate outcome here. It would take something quieter, something more deliberate, to determine the moment that would follow. The stage was set, and yet nothing had yet begun. The air shifted subtly when the kickboxer stepped forward. His voice was measured, polite even, but it carried a weight that demanded recognition. He questioned Bruce's approach not with mockery, nor with aggression, but with an implicit comparison. Endurance, discipline, traditional structure versus innovation, speed and adaptability. The students felt the tension without a sound. They had expected bravado, perhaps even theatrics. Instead, the challenge was almost clinical, a deliberate placement of doubt, designed to elicit a reaction. The room held its breath, aware that this was not a casual demonstration. This was a test of authority placed squarely in public view. Bruce did not respond immediately. He did not raise his voice. He did not step forward or retreat. His eyes, calm and precise, remained on the kickboxer, taking in stance, angle, and intent. There was no indication that he felt pressure. No hint that he considered the challenge a provocation. Yet, even in stillness, he communicated something far more potent than words: recognition of skill and absolute control over his own. The challenger, sensing the absence of reaction, adjusted subtly, weight shifting, shoulders tensing. Every student in the room noticed, a ripple of expectation passing through them. Bruce's calmness was not an absence. It was an assertion. By refusing to react in the expected manner, he redefined the terms of engagement without a single movement. A few moments passed. The kickboxer repeated the challenge, framing it as an invitation rather than a confrontation. Polite, precise, controlled, the kind of challenge that demanded either a refusal or an acceptance. There was no room for theatrics here, only clarity. Bruce's nod, almost imperceptible, was all the acceptance required. And with that, the atmosphere shifted further. Observers described the moment as a silent agreement. The challenge would proceed, but on Bruce's terms. The hall no longer measured the exchange by size, by reputation, or by history. It measured only presence. Every student understood, even if only subconsciously, that they were about to witness something rare. Not a fight in the ordinary sense, but a demonstration of mastery. A lesson in authority that required no commentary, no applause, no fanfare. And then, with nothing more than a breath and a nod, the room's attention narrowed entirely to the space between the two men. The moments before contact stretched longer than they appeared. Observers felt them expand, though the clock showed only seconds. The students shifted slightly, as if sensing that every microsecond held significance. They had anticipated a prolonged exchange, an extended contest of skill, strength, and stamina. What unfolded, however, would not conform to expectation. The kickboxer moved with deliberate preparation. His warm-up was a ritual. Stretches measured and precise, a rotation of joints that spoke of experience and repetition. Every motion reinforced his authority, a silent statement that he was a master in his own domain. He exhaled sharply, shoulders tense yet controlled. His eyes fixed on Bruce with the certainty of a man accustomed to obedience from opponents. Bruce, by contrast, remained still, his body relaxed yet perfectly aligned. His hands hovered subtly, ready but inert, reflecting a readiness that did not need announcement. There was no flexing of muscles, no dramatic posture. He did not mirror the challenger's rituals, nor did he appear to prepare. Yet every student, every witness, could sense an undercurrent of power, precise, contained, and utterly deliberate. The contrast was palpable. The hall, which had felt static in the earlier minutes, now seemed to hold its breath. The kickboxer's authority, built through reputation and ritual, faced something intangible. A calm, observational mastery that seemed impervious to challenge. The expectation of dominance rested uneasily on him now, as if the weight of the room's collective gaze had shifted slightly, imperceptibly, toward Bruce. Subtle signs began to appear. The kickboxer adjusted his stance more often, eyes flicking momentarily to Bruce, searching for an unspoken cue. Movements that had once been automatic now bore traces of hesitation. Students noticed these microchanges, the slightest pause before a strike, a fractional shift in weight, a momentary recalibration of rhythm. Bruce's stillness was not passive. It was anticipatory. He absorbed each detail, angle of attack, distance, intention. He did not react, because reaction was not yet required. In this quiet observation, He asserted psychological dominance without aggression. Authority in this room was no longer measured by size, nor by prior accolades, but by the capacity to control the narrative of presence itself. The tension settled into something heavier than anticipation. The students knew that the engagement, when it came, would not be long nor loud. It would be decisive, economical, and profoundly instructive. All else, the rituals, the gestures, the expectation, had already been stripped away by the weight of deliberate observation. The room waited, not for a clash of strength, but for clarity. When the engagement began, it was almost imperceptible. There was no shout, no dramatic step forward, no flourish of limbs. Observers described it later as a movement so precise it seemed less like combat and more like the sudden turning of a lock, subtle, deliberate, and final. The kickboxer initiated as custom dictated with a measured strike. Every eye tracked him, expecting a prolonged exchange. Attack, counter, rhythm, endurance. But Bruce met the movement with an economy of motion that defied expectation. A single adjustment, subtle yet deliberate, shifted the angle of engagement. Balance faltered, not catastrophically, but enough to interrupt certainty. For 8 seconds, the room existed in a suspended state. Every breath, every micro-movement was magnified. Bruce did not strike indiscriminately. He did not overwhelm. He did not raise his voice. He simply intersected the challenger's action with precision, altering its trajectory and, with it, the confidence behind it. The students later recalled that it felt instantaneous, though memory stretched it into an elongated perception. The kickboxer's eyes widened briefly, a flicker of recalculation passing across a face accustomed to authority. Every muscle that had relied on routine instinct now paused, registering that the expected outcome had already shifted. Bruce's movements were minimal, almost invisible, yet the effect was undeniable. In the space of 8 seconds, the hierarchy of the room had inverted. Control no longer rested with the man who had challenged, but with the one who had observed, calculated, and acted with unerring precision. No one in the room shouted. No one moved forward to intervene. The demonstration did not escalate into a fight because it did not need to. Continuation would have been superfluous. Authority had been established through method, through observation, through the quiet power of efficiency. When the moment ended, the challenger did not collapse, nor did he strike back. He simply stepped back, eyes registering a new reality. The room exhaled collectively, though no sound marked the release. The lesson was not loud. It was precise, contained, and irreversible. Bruce stood still, as he had from the beginning, his presence unchanged. The demonstration was complete. The silence that followed carried more weight than any verbal declaration ever could. The room remained still long after the engagement ended. The kickboxer, once the unquestioned figure of authority, had retreated a half-step, not from injury, nor from fear, but from the subtle realization that the terms of mastery had shifted. He stood upright, composed, yet the confidence that had defined his presence before now bore cracks invisible to anyone not paying close attention. Students, witnesses, and instructors alike processed the moment in silence. Conversations did not resume immediately. The hall held its collective breath, absorbing the demonstration without commentary. No one applauded. There was no call for recognition. The clarity of what had occurred was enough. In those quiet seconds, the method had spoken for itself. Bruce did not step forward to explain, nor did he attempt to justify his approach. There was no lecture, no performance. His stillness, now accentuated, communicated far more than any words could. The lesson had been delivered through action, precise, measured, and irreversible. Observers later described the effect on the kickboxer as a psychological pause. He was recalculating, not defeated physically, but interrupted in the narrative he had carried into the room. His habitual certainty, forged through repetition and victories, no longer applied. The silence pressed in, revealing a truth he could not contest. Mastery was not measured by size, by reputation, or by ritual. It was measured by presence, by observation, and by efficiency of action. Students began to murmur quietly among themselves, sharing fragments of realization. They spoke not of the 8 seconds of movement, but of the larger implication. Control could be achieved without dominance, clarity without noise. Bruce's method had rewritten the parameters of authority in the room, and every witness understood that they had seen something rare, something precise, and something permanent. Even as people left the hall, the weight of the moment lingered. It was not excitement that carried forward, nor fear. It was understanding, the slow, quiet recognition of an efficiency so profound that it demanded reflection. By the time the doors closed behind the last observer, the demonstration had already begun to transform into story. Not rumor, not exaggeration story. Witnesses would recount it not as a contest, but as a turning point. A lesson in control, a subtle recalibration of perception, delivered without fanfare, and remembered without embellishment. The room, now empty of bodies but still heavy with presence, held only silence, and in that silence, the quiet authority of the method persisted. Years passed, and the hall itself became a memory for many of those who had witnessed the event. Some of the students moved on, taking with them not medals or titles, but the quiet imprint of a demonstration that had altered their understanding of mastery. They recounted it in conversations with peers, not as legend inflated by repetition, but as a factual moment that had reframed their perception of skill. The kickboxer continued his career, traveling, teaching, and demonstrating. To the outside world, his victories and achievements remained intact. Yet those who had been present that day recalled a subtle change in posture, a slight hesitation, a pause in certainty that had never fully disappeared. It was not humiliation, nor resentment, but recognition. In that brief encounter, the rules of engagement had been silently rewritten. Bruce Lee's presence, once quiet at the edges of a room, became the reference point for countless interpretations of efficiency and authority. The story of the 8-second demonstration traveled slowly, carried by those who understood the nuance. That mastery was not loud, that control was not force, and that the most decisive victories required no spectacle. Years later, students returned to the hall, older and seasoned. They spoke not of the challenger's reputation, nor of the fight itself, but of the method that had been observed. They described it with reverence, but not awe. The recollection was analytical, precise. They recalled how a single, deliberate action could shift balance, not through strength, but through timing, observation, and presence. Even decades later, martial artists, historians, and casual witnesses would recount the event, not to glorify a victory, nor to cement a myth, but to convey the lasting impact of presence over performance. The hall, the students, the challenger each became part of a narrative defined not by aggression, but by efficiency and psychological clarity. And in every retelling, the moment itself remained unchanged. 8 seconds had redefined understanding. The lesson was neither spoken nor written. It was remembered, absorbed, and quietly practiced. The story became legend because it refused embellishment, surviving solely on the undeniable precision of action and the authority of calm mastery. Long after the names of those present had faded into history, the event persisted as a reference point. A singular instance where observation, restraint, and clarity overcame expectation, and where the room itself, witness to a brief yet decisive demonstration, remained the keeper of the truth. In that silence, the method endured, not as myth, not as spectacle, but as principle, a quiet authority that, once observed, could never be unlearned.